Well, it's good to see each one of you for this conversation on St. Gregory of Nyssa's two works about, well, the one about Saint Macrina, his extraordinary relationship to her, and then the other one, which is the dialogue on the soul and resurrection, in which Macrina is Socrates, and he is the young student probing things, but at the same time, there's deep concerns at work in it. So I'm looking forward to what each of you have to say about this. So thank you, Andrew, for inviting us to participate in this with you. And you had asked me to speak a little bit about, I guess, a little bit about sainthood, since it's Saint Macrina and Saint Gregory. And I know so little about sainthood, but I've thought about it over the years in a variety of ways, but none of that seemed very satisfactory to me when I was thinking about our gathering together. But what did suggest itself to me is actually a passage from Maximus, the Confessor, a passage from Ambigua 10, which we looked at not long ago in our Maximus seminars. And I think I would like to read it slowly. And because I think at the heart of it is really the best of the way the Christian East understands the fruit that is born, the transfiguration that occurs in the life of those people that we see as saints. My own view is that the church officially canonizes a lot of people for a great variety of reasons. But I think in what Maximus has to say here, we see the very heart of the matter. And my own sense is that Saint Macrina, from Gregory's perspective, became this saint, her disposition, her way of being in the world, and the well-being, as Maximus would have it, that she lived out of, is an example of this. So if it's okay with you, let me just read this to you as a way of perhaps providing a little bit of ground for us. So this is Maximus the Confessor from Ambigua 10, which is a contemplation of the epileptic. It was a gain, I think, from this material dyad, by which I mean anger and desire, that the Lord freed the epileptic. For whereas the evil demon wished to destroy him by the fire of anger and the water of desire, the Lord restrained his frenzied ravings. Now, in those men who have been defeated by material things, their relation to generation and corruption differs in no way from the waxing and the waning of the moon. The demon, who arouses the passions, takes possession of this relation and casts the mind into the fire of anger and the water of desire, seeking to drown it, and will not cease from this until the word of God appears and drives away the wicked material spirit, and so frees the possessed man from the evil tyranny, restoring to him and granting him his natural soundness of mind, having genuinely received the divine and unerring word, passed through this present age, without their souls leaving so much as a footprint in any of its pleasures. For it was on the highest attributes, the logoi, accessible to man concerning God, namely God's goodness and love, that they rightly concentrated their vision, their way of seeing. And it was from these that they learned that God was moved to give being to all things that exist, and to grant them the grace of well-being, if it is permissible to speak of movement with respect to God, who alone is the unmoved, and not rather of his will, which moves all things, bringing them into and sustaining them in being, while never in any way being moved itself. And it was with a view to these, and here's my point, that the saints wisely modeled themselves. And owning to their expert imitation, they now bear the distinguishing characteristics manifest through the virtues of the hidden and invisible beauty of the divine magnificence. Thus they themselves become good and lovers of both God and their fellow human beings, full of compassion and mercy, and were proved to possess one single disposition of love for the whole of mankind, by means of which they held fast throughout the whole of their earthly life to the ultimate form of virtue, by which I mean humility, which is a firm safeguard in all that is good and undermines everything that is opposed to it. And so they become impregnable to the temptations that besiege them, both those that fall within the power of our will to control and those that do not. Where they wore down through continence the internal rebellion of the former, and by patience, patient endurance, they repelled the onslaught of the latter. For being attacked on two fronts, that is, by glory and dishonor, they remained unshaken and unmovable in the face of both, being neither wounded by insults, thanks to their voluntary self-abrogation, nor succumbing to earthly glory, thanks to their extreme familiarity with poverty. And thus, they were dominated neither by anger, nor envy, nor rivalry, nor hypocrisy, nor cunning, nor calculated pretenses of friendship aimed to deceive through appearances and manipulate things towards some other end, which is the most destructive of all human passions, nor desire for the seemingly splendid things of life, nor any other vice from the wicked swarm of the passions, nor threats directed at them from their enemies, nor any form of death. Therefore, they are rightly judged to be blessed both by God and by men. For by the grace of the bountiful God, they made themselves shining images of the radiant, ineffable glory that is to come, so that, filled with joy, they might be united with the principles of those very virtues that they had come to know, or rather, with God, for whose sake they, dying a daily death, patiently endured their life on earth. For in him pre-exist the principles of all good things, as if from an ever-flowing spring, in a single, simple, unified embrace, and they draw to him all those who rightly and naturally use the powers that have been given to them for this very purpose. When I read this again the other day, I thought of, Gregory on his way to having gotten word that his sister was at the end of her life, on his way hurrying to see her. And then, of course, he arrives, and we have the description of that. And then in the soul and resurrection, the kind of disposition that he has as he talks with her, and that at least comes across to me in her way of engaging him. There's some playfulness in it seems to me. There is a bit of the younger brother, older sister engagement in it. But this sense that Maximus speaks of how the saints have wisely modeled themselves, how through the struggle with what he calls the material dyad, with anger and desire, that anger and desire have, in a sense, run their course. And Saint Macrina came to a different place. That place which is described as, in a way, the fruit of humility. It's interesting to me, I've never really thought about it a lot, how humility, we often think of prudence as the virtue, the meta virtue. And there's good reason for that. But another way of thinking of it, I suppose, is that what is at the heart of prudence? Is prudence possible? Prudence can't exist without humility. So it gives you the disposition. Humility is the disposition of prudence, not presuming, not reacting, seeking to be attentive, seeking to be present. So this description of coming finally to a simple place, becoming in some sense singular, as Maximus says at the end of this passage, to the place of the unified embrace, or what I would call coming to the place of presence, and where that disposition is normal, the normal disposition for the saint. Strikes me as one of the gifts of the way in which sanctity is understood to bear fruit in human beings, and which I think we see in her in a lovely way. And maybe in terms of the whole family, and perhaps Anna will speak about this, it's such an interesting family because this is not something you would say about St. Basil. St. Basil did not, at least what we know about him, did not manifest that particular dimension of sanctity. So in any case,
he may not have exhibited it.
Enough.
He may not have exhibited it, but Basil may not have exhibited it, but Macrina is the teacher in the family. And it's very interesting that you point to humility as the fundamental virtue, because I noted something else in your reading. He says that humility makes us impregnable. And one of the things that we ought to do when we're thinking about saints or women or humility or virginity is to remember that this is a word, David, you understand this very well, which means not, which means whole unto its own, right? Of a fullness that, or of a presence. So I like that link, but I want to ask you about two other things that you said, David, in an effort to draw it forth into considering how Gregory and Macrina address ideas and personhood. On the last page you read, you said that the saints are free from any form of death, right? Maximus says, free from any form of death. And at the very beginning of that passage, you say that saints are those who remain, Maximus says, undefeated by material things, not defeated by material things. Forms of death. Does mortality mean we primarily have forms of death that needs to be transformed into life? Or is forms of death regarding something else? And defeated by material things, that strikes me that this is what the whole dialogue, at least on the soul and resurrection, is about. We can't get around our conception of material. We can't get around our conception of nature, of physis. It's that. It's not a spiritual truth that we stumble over. So that's the other thing. What does it mean to be defeated by material things, or is that akin to form of death? The other question I have, and these you can deal with them how you will, and then we'll move onwards. You bring up the wonderful distinction that Maximus makes between being and well-being, and Maximus says that well-being is characterized by grace, or is a grace-filled. All right. In Maximus's way of phrasing these things, and then we'll draw from this for Gregory, we have being, we have well-being, and we have eternal well-being. Eternal well-being is akin to the resurrection, perhaps. Well-being may be akin to a state of sainthood, if I comprehend what you're saying and what the Maximus is teaching us and Gregory is teaching us. The question is there a difference? Can one discern a difference between being and well-being? What does it mean to even try to discern that in another person? Pardon me, play with it as you like.
Well, my sense is that for Gregory or for Maximus, well-being or being is of course good, And the perfection of your being, the perfection of the virtues, gives you being, gives you the fullness of being. But there's something more than that, which is well-being. And well-being, if I've understood this, well-being is when you find yourself also in the presence of God's grace. So I've sometimes wondered, I've never done as much on the Stoics as I wished I had. I've often wondered if in Stoicism, that the Stoic understanding of the perfection of the virtues and somebody like Maximus's understanding of being amount to pretty much the same thing. And the distinction comes with the understanding that God's grace transfigures life. It doesn't just perfect it, it transfigures it. And so to my mind, that's, if I understand this properly, that's a key matter there. The forms of death, or perhaps maybe the first one, being defeated by material things. I think what is intended there, and it's what we find in so much of the spiritual teaching of the church, is we have a capacity as human beings to be colonized by the appearance of things. So defeated by material things, it just strikes me as a way of speaking about that colonization, that we become captives of our passions associated with particular things, which are not in and of themselves bad, but which kind of foreshorten our human capacity and limit our relationship to the life of the world. Forms of death. I've thought, Andrew, for a long time that there's this huge distinction in the scriptures, particularly in the Gospels and in the Second Testament. But I think it's there in the Hebrew Bible as well. This huge distinction between death and mortality, death and finitude. We are mortal, we're creatures. And in a way, our mortality is also our glory. That's why I like to say that, the Magna Carta of the Christian tradition is the words of Jesus Christ, that we have all fallen short of the glory of God. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's not a judgment. That's a note of liberation. You don't have to worry about that. That's not the point. Our mortality, our finitude, is our glory as human beings. Death is a condition of estrangement, born of presumption, born of assuming what it all means. And so the forms of death in our life are ubiquitous. all of those occasions where we are no longer able to be attentive, no longer able to be in the presence of, where we have made up our minds, or where we speak colonizing words. All of those occasions where there is curse, not in any formal way, because that's obvious. But maybe it's better to put it, all those occasions where we are not living in a blessed moment, that is an anointed moment. Blessing, as we know in the Hebrew Bible, is what happens when our name is called. Blessing is anointing with the oil of gladness. So the forms of death are all those occasions where we are not attentive to the fact that each breath is blessed. But what do you think?
That's a beautiful way to sustain our minds. Each breath is blessed. No, each breath is blessed. And it's when we forget that and we begin looking for something special or something that's different from what's around us, from what we love commonly, that we begin to go awry. Yeah. I mean, this work, but the thing is, this work almost lends itself to that because of how, well, for two things. It's got an arresting saint involved, an arresting title, right? It's got a arresting set of themes. But we ask, can one extract concepts from something like this? Can one? And I think only, as you've been demonstrating, David, and as Maximus talks about modeling, only with great care. Only with great care. And sometimes it could be useful to think of a term or a concept or a word in lumberjack terms, right? When we go to a text and we're trying to look for a word or an idea, and we remove it or extract it without care, then we're forgetting its own being. We should think rather as if we're walking into a forest and seeking to extract a tree. We have to know the forest, first of all, and discern the fall line, where the tree will, how the concept will lay, how we're going to draw it out, what kind of energy will be released when we cut into that wood or cut into the material, the stuff of the tree or the concept. And then in which soil does the concept sit, and which roots has it set down there? And what are the relations seen and unseen within the environment? So it strikes me that this idea of extraordinary or extraction is key here. And I think that we want to take care not to treat it complex work. And these are complex works. I'm speaking mainly about on the soul and resurrection, but we're holding the vita, the life in mind too. We don't want to treat complex works as a site from which we may just extract quotable lines, right? Quotable lines. Or reduce its integrity to some kind of sum that can be drawn, right? That's why summarizations of works always make me nervous. If it could be summarized, it would have been already, but it can't be. And so it's not in quotable lines or extractable truths that the work finds its strength, but rather it's in the way that it grants us to see again, as you were talking, David, to see again, but to see anew what is there, present, to renew our presence. If that's the heart of the work, then how does a work become authoritative? How does the truth of a work become authoritative? Why should we think that this is any more authoritative than anything else? Well, that depends on our notion of authority. If we think of authority as coming from title or name or position or exactness of thoughts, right? then it is more like besting another person, right? I've bested you, so I'm more authoritative. But authority, which one of the Greek terms for authority means out of the essence of, from within, right? Out of the essence of. And authority, if authority arises from within the integral essence of something, right? Then we can ask, regarding on the soul and the resurrection, of what kind of authority, what's the integral essence of the book? What kind of authority is the truth that flows from Macrina's work, transposed by Gregory? And here's the question. Are these insights wrested from the rhythm of tradition? Or are these insights wrested from the rhythm of a visit, so to speak? Right? What are we witnessing here? Something ordinary or something extraordinary? In other words, are we thinking about theological articulation? And this is one of the most profound articulations that we have. Are we thinking of theological articulation as a special event that gives us something? Or as just a way of emphasizing what is already present? Right? Is this something profoundly shared in common, or something different that inwardly forms Macrina's truth? Is it unique to her? Well, in our tradition, we have not much extraordinary, but we have plenty of extravagance. Not much extraordinary. I'm so pleased that this came up early in your remarks, David, because I think it's important. We have plenty of adornment of meaning, plenty of extravagance, but extravagance attends to form. It makes form rich with meaning, and extravagance is nearly always rooted in simple truth. Right? Something extraordinary departs from form. It leaves the rhythm common to our lives. So it's not rooted in simple truth. It's rooted in something which seems to stand out. Seems to stand out. We have, the tradition has ways of trying to consider things that stand out or seem to stand out under the term ecstasis. And it's often said that the saints experience a kind of ecstasis, or it could be said, right? Which means so does everybody, because the saints are like us. But ecstasy here doesn't mean standing out as in difference. It means standing before and forth and unto something. Standing before and forth and unto something. So Macrina is not standing out from the tradition. She's within the tradition, standing before and forth and unto something. In other words, Christian ecstasis is a way of figuring a personal synergy in which grace permeates the whole, untroubled. Grace permeates the whole, untroubled. Most of us probably grace is quite troubled because we contend with it. So ecstasis is not standing out, but really standing more deeply within. This is Macrina standing, and St. Gregory, standing more deeply within the tradition, not being extraordinary. And so this means then that all great writing, Maximus, Gregory, Basil, his brother, it doesn't stand out as an artifact in this sense. It stands within. Our voices, their voices, saints' voices, pastors' voices, friends' voices, give phrase to the currents of our tradition, right? And so, with a word that naturally stands out, something like apokatastasis, right, which is a big, it's an arresting term here. But without going far, let's just think for a minute what it's trying to articulate from within the tradition. Apokatastasis has nearly contrary movements in its first two prefixes, and then stasis. So it's heading towards it. It's katastasis and apostasis put together. It implies that we are to hold and build meaning as one integral experience, right? It also means that being encompasses time. Being encompasses time. David just spoke about this beautifully. Being encompasses time. In Maximus's phrasing, we have Genesis and then kinesis and then telos. Kinesis is time-bound, it's movement, it's where we are. So what does this matter? Well, restoration, which is usually how, or sometimes how, apokatastasis is translated, is not a time-bound word. It's not a time-bound word. The re points to fullness, not recovery. There's no sense of recovery or time in that word. What does that mean? It means that we articulate things in time. We articulate things in time. But the presence we articulate, as David says so well, is beyond time. The presence we are articulating in which we seek our fullness is beyond, it surmounts time. It transcends time. We articulate things in time, which means when the fire is present, when there's presence or communion amongst us, there's no need to articulate it. It's there. So what does this mean? This means that dialogue is for the sake of presence, right? Not presence for the sake of dialogue. Dialogue is for the sake of presence. So all our lives must be for the sake of personal presence and communion in love. All our lives are for the sake of that. So dialogue becomes an alibi for presence, right? What Gregory is presenting in these two works is presence, sustained presence. The dialogue is an alibi for that. The dialogue is not an alibi for argument or self-assertion. So what does Gregory seek when he goes to Macrina? Well, the whole person is present and communicates in dialogue. And the integrity of the whole person is the subject matter of the book itself. The integrity. He's talking about the resurrection of the whole. And so this I guess emphasizes again that the integrity of the whole person is our form of meaning. The integrity of the whole person is what our church and our Lord teaches us, which is why we need to somehow face what Gregory, led by Macrina, gently, is trying to face. But it's a difficult thought, like we said. We can be defeated by material things. So is Macrina offering intellectual certainty? Is that how we're to understand her ideas? I suggest no, rather the movement or the energy of loving response. That's Macrina's authority. It's not certainty that we see here, but sure-footedness, confident steps along the path. Confident with faith steps along the path, but not certainty, sure-footedness. And how would it not be possible to doubt this teaching? How would it not be possible? Fair enough, but we do ourselves a disservice when we think that our doubt is intellectual, when we reduce the integrity of the person to the operation of the mind, and then have that as the meaning of this. One can have incarnate doubt, right? One can have incarnate doubt. And what do we mean by that? Abstract doubt, then, means life is reduced to intellectual certainty, which is impossible. Intellectual certainty is impossible. So life becomes reduced to the torment of uncertainty. Incarnate doubts, one proceeds on one's way. One is still alive along the way, but without certainty. But one is still proceeding, one is still drawing near, right? And this is, just to point to the text a little bit, this is part of what this pulling and doubting and movement is part of what Maximus refers to on 78 when he's talking about hope and memory, both circling around the beautiful and trying to sort out the relation, not leaving the relation, not certain, but trying to sort it out, right? And we also read in that passage, we understand that our basic spiritual movements is from anticipating to being completed by the divine beautiful. The divinely beautiful, or the beautiful divine, is a common emphasis in this work. But look on page, I want to read just a couple of passages on the page, bottom of page 79 over to 80, and then one a little bit later. 79 over to 80. Here, Gregory is talking about, well, a soul that has become godlike. So this is complementing the passage David read just a moment ago from Maximus, just at the bottom of 79. So the soul becomes godlike. Thus, it imitates the superior life, being conformed, that's the word, conformed to the properties of the divine nature, so that nothing else is left to it but the disposition of love. There's disposition, David. As it becomes attached in its nature to the beautiful. This is love, the interior attachment to that which is pleasing. So when the soul has become simple and uniform and an accurate image of God, so when the soul, which has become simple and uniform and an accurate image of God, finds that truly simple and material good, the one thing which is really lovable and desirable, it attaches itself to itself and combines with it through the impulse and operation of love. It conforms itself to that which is always being grasped and found, and becomes through its likeness to the good that which the nature is in which it participates. The path of beauty begins to conform us, shape us together with the divinity into the disposition of love. It's formation we're talking about, not certainty, not exactitude, formation, and the formation of our whole soul, as it were, spirit and body. Now, on page 84, I just want to point to a couple of notes. This conformation, right, adopts a language of drawing near. Maximus uses the phrase drawing near. And if our goal is inner transformation, or to conform with God, then our telos, our fullness, is our loving disposition in presence with another. That loving disposition, that drawing near unto another, as Gregory says, 4 lines up from the bottom of the first paragraph, God draws his own to himself. God draws his own to himself, his own unto his own. And so our drawing near is also God's drawing us near. God's drawing us near. And then just one last passage, which beautifully points to personhood and receptivity and what it does for us when we draw near to each other in kind of in holy simplicity. And this is page 87, just 12 or 13 lines up from the bottom of the page. Basically the middle of that paragraph. For the participation, you see, for the participation in the divine good is such that it makes anyone into whom it enters, greater and more receptive. Participation in the divine good is such that it makes anyone into whom it enters, God draws us near, greater, larger in spirit, and more receptive. So deeper participation in God, what we see in the saints, makes us more deeply receptive. The saints show us how to be receptive to creation, how to be as a form of response. And so this leads to a lovely idea of synergy as our co-response, our co-responsiveness to God. We are responding and God is co-responding with us. larger, more receptive. What does it mean to be more receptive in our personhood, Anna? What does it mean to have our personality expanded, to make it larger and more receptive? What's your sense of this? Anna, you're muted.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for inviting me to participate, and thank you for these thoughts, Andrew. And I think the way I would like to approach a question is to look at the story of the receptivity of Gregory in his encounter with Macrina, because he tells, basically, I'm going to look at On the Soul and the Life of Macrina together as part of a kind of narrative that Gregory uses to help us understand some of these ideas that you talked about. What makes us receptive? What makes us open? And how, when we are open and when we are receptive to another, we then begin to see differently and thus to live differently. And to my mind, I like to see the life of Macrina, I've been thinking about this, as kind of bookends, in the middle of which is On the Soul. And so if we read it this way, we see that the life of Macrina, if I may be so bold as to sort of think through with Gregory how he wanted to tell about his sister, he needed to show two things. He needed, on the one hand, to talk about his influence on her through her dialogue with him. But for him, this was not enough. He needed also to tell her life, right? Because I think to him, her life and her influence were of a piece and could not be separated. So if we begin with the life, right, it's a story of her. What's interesting about the life is it's a story of her works, right? It's a story of how she is educated, but really lives a life of prayer and service. And he talks about this all the time, that her humility led her to work with her hands, to cook food for her mother, to do the very daily practical things that you might think, given her erudition and her status, would be beyond her. But I think this was very important because for him, her labor was both intellectual and practical. She is his guide, but she is his guide not necessarily just through her words, but also in her personal and experiential guiding of him through her example. And he's very interesting when he talks about her. Her words in the life aren't given concretely, but he uses the language of, my soul was lifted up by the help of her words. Her language was a fountain of water. Her language was the seeds of good works that led to mighty fruit. So she is the foundation, both through her actions and her guidance. She leaves no writings of her own. She doesn't write. She is, in a way, as we said, too humble for that. But in her humility, she becomes something so much more than a theologian who leaves works, right? She becomes, I think, the word fountain, wellspring, seed is the appropriate one. So in the story of the life of Macrina, Gregory comes to her in sadness at the death of her brother, both of their brother, Basil, and he is simultaneously struck by the fact that she is also dying. So he comes to her to draw near to her in a time of trouble, This is the image of drawing near. His grief brings him to her. And by bringing him to her, it allows him to be consoled by her, not again, simply by her words, but also by her dying prayers, right? So in other words, the consolation is twofold. It's both real and it is practical. It is both verbal and practical. And this is what I find very interesting as a kind of leading up to this question that I want to discuss, which is grief and how grief leads to drawing near, and how grief becomes for Gregory in both the life and on the soul, the conduit, the way by which wisdom comes to him. So what's interesting to me in both texts is that two things seem to happen. On the one hand, Gregory is very open, honest about the emotion that overwhelms him. And he uses words like the flood of grief, the flood of anguish, the lamentation, the unreason that overcomes him, both because of the death of his brother and because of her. So he both confesses this grief and is very open about it, but at the same time understands in some way, or feels guilty about the grief, feels that it is wrong, feels that it is a sign of his unbelief. And he actually says this to her. He says the problem he has is that he knows that he should not grieve as one who has no hope. And yet he does. This is at least how it's presented in the text, becomes a question of faith for him. Because if he knows that he should not grieve as one who has no hope, but he grieves anyway, and grieves repeatedly and quite violently at times, then does he actually believe? And he actually confesses to her at one point, he says, you know, maybe I believe as a kind of interior slavery, as a kind of at command. I am told to believe in the resurrection and I should just obey. And I cannot do this. So grief then becomes a path, he thinks, to disbelief. And so when he confesses this to her, she does something very, very interesting. And I think this is where the language of the text points towards, again, her guidance, not as an abstract set of principles. Well, if you believe, then here are the things you need to believe. And if you don't believe, here are the things you don't believe. He says something very interesting. She doesn't rebuke him, but he says, like an expert equestrian, allows me the play of my emotions, which she then reins in. In other words, she does not begin her argument against his grief by confronting it head on and saying, you should not grieve, or you should grieve. And she talks about it a little bit, but she knows this is not sufficient. Instead, she guides, she teaches, she leads. She allows his grief to move away from being an obstacle to his faith and causes his grief to become a path to greater belief. And in doing this in the text, these are the two moves that she does. I think what's really interesting is that she does in practice what she will also teach him in concept, which is that emotion is not evil in itself. and indeed all the spectrum of human feelings and desires, including anger, are in themselves not evils, but depend entirely upon the direction in which they are put or guided. She talks about this quite explicitly. And what's so interesting is that it leads her to say that, you know, if we are going to experience these emotions as human beings, we are created with these emotions. These emotions are part of our createdness. This is where we are similar with the animals. But God has created everything for a purpose. And the purpose of our emotions is that, guided properly, it can actually lead us to the divine. And so she says, in the text, that without anger, we could not defeat our enemies. Without cowardice, we could not be prudent. Without love, we could not ascend to the divine. So it is really a matter of not just telling him this, but actually showing him how his own disposition, his own desire, his own emotions are the path and not the obstacle towards the higher truth. And this is where I think his metaphor of him lifting, of her lifting him up, right? His words, her words lift him up, right? In both the very real sense and in the emotional sense, by showing him the path, right? Taking him out of where he was before and moving him into a higher place. And so emotion is one thing that runs as a theme in both texts. But what's interesting to me, and here we have to, something very interesting happens in the life of Saint Macrina, is that his grief, in talking to her and on the soul, he finds solace, he finds consolation, he finds the proper path. As he watches her die, it's an experience for him unlike any other, right? He watches her move towards the divine. He watches her give he has this wonderful, wonderful image of her last breath, which closed her prayer and her life together. It closed her prayer and her life together. In other words, her life was a prayer. And when one ended, so did the other, right? So it closed everything together. So for him, this was an experience of being in the presence of a dying saint, which moved him completely. But the story doesn't end there. You would think that the story should end there, and it does not end there. And I think this is where Gregory, for me, was an absolute illumination, because they go through the funeral rites, they bury her, and it all comes back. The flood of emotions comes back, right? He enters into a state of lamentation, which he hates. He hates lamentation. He thinks lamentation is this giving in to the bestial side of humanity, but he does it again. And he actually has these words in the life: I threw myself on the grave and embraced the dust, downcast and tearful, pondering over the greatness of my loss. He had just had the experience that I don't think I will ever have in my lifetime, certainly of watching a saint die. But he came back to the flood of emotion. And here I think he does something I have not seen in other saints' lives. He draws us in to this moment. He does not wish to offer us the false hope that grief can vanish with a proper disposition. It is a struggle that will be lifelong. Right? Grief is present always. It is there. It will haunt us. It will attack us. He actually envisions it as a kind of attack, right? Where you get flooded, you get overwhelmed, you get so what do you do? Well, this is the beauty of his narrative. So he changes the subject. He says, so then I'm walking and I run into someone who knew my sister before, and he had a daughter who was blind. And, you know, long story short, Macrina, through her prayers, cured his daughter's blindness. And then Gregory says, and I think we should end here. Right. Which is great. Right. This is a good way to end. And I thought about that, especially today, and I thought, well, that seems odd. It almost seems cut off. Like, we were going to tell all these great stories. There's this wonderful image of her death. It was just beautiful and beyond. And then sort of an afterthought, like, oh, there was this baby cured. I mean, you could think of it as a kind of evidence of miracles, but he has other miracle stories in the text. And I think that's the second theme that he really wants us to talk about, and that's blindness, lack of openness, lack of receptivity, to be closed off. And so blindness, I think, as kind of the second theme of both the Macrina life and also on the soul, is something that really more than anything else in the text, I really spoke to me. Grief was not just an obstacle to his faith because it showed a lack of self-control and a lack of... Grief was also related to blindness, to the closing off. And he uses this, and here's where, and I'm going to soon move over to Michael, because I think here's where Macrina actually points him in the right direction as to blindness. She accuses him, Gregory, of being an Epicurean, right? Epicurus. Because he says to her, how can you not grieve when you see the body of a beloved person disappear, decay, diminish? When you see the light go out of someone's eyes, how can you not grieve? And he says, so you say the soul lives on, but where is the soul? Where is it? I cannot see it. It does not appear to me. I do not understand it because I cannot perceive it, right? And again, the brilliance of Macrina, I think, is that she says, you've become like Epicurus, for whom appearance defines nature, right? Appearance was what we talked about earlier. So appearance defines nature. Perception of the material world is the standard. And if you have that standard, if you have that understanding of appearance, if you perceive only the surface, then the soul does not exist. But she said, be careful, because by that definition, God does not exist either, because you cannot see him. She says, that this attentiveness to appearance alone is in fact blindness. And that's where the theme of the blind child, I think, gets worked into the text. I'm going to read a passage, page 31, which I think is just, I just find it beautiful. This is bottom of page 31, and she's talking, I think, about Epicurus. He completely closed the eyes of his soul and was unable to look at any of the bodiless things which are known by the intellect, just as someone who is shut up in a little hut remains unaware of the heavenly marvels because he is prevented by the walls and roof from seeing what is outside. All perceptible things which are seen in the universe are simply a sort of earthly walls which shut off small-souled people from the vision of intelligible things. All right. But she goes deeper. So you think she's making a Platonic move here, where it says the invisible is superior to the visible. And in a part, that is what she's saying. But there's a different mode of sight, which she recommends to him, which is true sight, which does not, and this is, I think, for me, one of the most important things, which does not eschew the material world, but rather requires you to see the material world in a completely different manner, in a way that is not blind. And true sight, the one that will not wall you off, is in fact sight in which you see that creation openly proclaims its maker. The very heavens, as the prophet says, are telling the glory of God with silent voices. It is not the mere perception of the material world that leads us to be blind, but our inability to see that this material world is speaking to us about something else as well. So the material world does not end at the material, but speaks of that which is higher. And here too, for him, what was going to be most important for Gregory is that we are, as persons, our personhood is in fact the path to true sight. And here she uses something that will become such an important thing for the fathers through Maximus and Saint Simeon, the new theologian, that man is a microcosm, created as a microcosm of the entire universe. The reason we can see the world as created by its maker is because we are a microcosm of all of creation. We contain in ourselves the elements of everything. Now, this is not to get arrogant and say we are divine, in that sort of we are equal to the divine. And she has this, again, the language, the attentiveness to language is I think, amazing. She said, a small fragment of glass reflects the entire circle of the sun. Right? So we are that small fragment of glass, and we can reflect the circle of the sun, which is not to say we are the sun, but rather that we can understand creation and its proclamation of the maker, because we ourselves are made as these links between the created world and the divine. We are alone in this as human beings. So grief then, if we get back to this question of grief, grief results from blindness, the inability to see the soul as immortal, the resurrection, the divine, right? That's where grief comes from. But in his telling grief is a path to vision as well. Because grief allows you to come near, come toward him who created, and those around us who can, in fact, help bring sight to us. So to sum up, she brings him sight that he thinks he has not seen before. And I want to talk a little bit about her legacy, and in sort of kind of tying together some of the things that David and Andrew have said, talk about humility. It's very tempting in the modern age when everybody feels the need to write things down in various forms. It's very interesting to me that she did not write, and that she did not need to write. She is a part of our tradition without having left any personal record of herself. So what does that mean? It is through that humility, through the refusal to leave anything personal of herself. There's this wonderful, again, image in the life where she doesn't even have clothes in which to be buried, right? She has one outfit that she has worn, and she will be buried in that. She has no glory, earthly glory, that she will even carry with her into the grave. And yet, right, if, what's the scriptural verse? A seed of corn must die in order to bring forth fruit, right? So she is humble to the point of death. And she then, out of that humility, out of that very humility, becomes what Gregory calls the wellspring, the seed, right? There are multiple points in time when Gregory talks about how, I mean, this is kind of funny. This ties back to the older sister motif, where she puts Gregory and Basil in their place. She says at one point in On the Soul, do you not see, or I think it's On the Soul, where she says, do you not see that every ounce of fame that you've been given is given to you by God because you have no natural talents, right? Basil comes back from being educated in Athens, and she puts him in his place. Just stop going around talking. Come, lead the ascetic life. Be a monastic, right? Be humble. So a wellspring, a seed, a guide. Would Gregory and Basil have been who they were without her guidance? And finally, vision. Right? Does she open the eyes of those around her to see what will then? So as a wellspring of tradition, I think it's useful to contemplate this idea of how one might think about the tradition. Think about it as a series of texts that we read, but is it, right? Or is it something that's a little bit more intangible, that looks a lot more like a fountain or a wellspring or a source or a way of seeing? So thank you all. I look forward to a little bit more. Michael, I would love to know a little bit more about what I talked about earlier, her relationship to sort of what she calls philosophy and what Gregory calls philosophy.
Well, thank you, Anna. You've provided so many swathes of areas that are all tied together in unexpected ways. That and I'm going to try to tie some of them together. I mean, this is going to be done in perhaps in a slightly fumbling way, because I'm sort of orchestrating my thoughts as I was listening to you. It sort of reorientated me in a lot of my thoughts, as David had just a few minutes before we began, when he characterized, as you just did, Macrina's characterization of the hugely influential Greek Hellenic culture in which patristic thought is inescapably grounded. And that presents a kind of hermeneutic challenge for us and touches upon the theme that we've just tacitly referred to when we mention dialogue and dialectic, because there's a dialectic within the tradition, and the tradition extends, some of David's allusions were making clear back to the Hebraic texts in which the most important parts of Revelation are grounded. But the Hellenic tradition is arguably hugely important. And in some ways, it's that which has to be contended against, but it's also pervasively influential. So that's an issue I want to raise. And it brings with it an important grounding that also, I think, is superseded. And so I'm going to try to present St. Gregory and Macrina embedded, obviously in Hebraic, but also in Hellenic, the Hellenic antecedent culture in particular, since you raise Plato, the obvious text which everyone refers to as Plato's Phaedo, and use Maximus the Confessor and his, I don't want to limit it by saying this hermeneutic attitude, but I would say also an ontological attitude. That's how I'm going to treat it. His apophatic stance to reconcile one point of difference that crops up in this sea of deep influence in which patristic thought is swimming. It's sometimes characterized as a Neoplatonic influence. But I think that's it's just unmistakable if one were to do a close reading, close comparative analysis of the Phaedo and on the soul and the resurrection. One doesn't even have to really look for intermediaries. The line of influence is just inescapable, which makes all the more startling one of the striking points of divergence in this influential culture. So let's just start by quickly. I'm not going to try to, because people can certainly do this on their own, and I'm not going to try to raise any issues that are referred to in literature which people consult. So I want to just throw out some ideas and assume that people can get up to speed with some of the background arguments that Socrates, for example, makes, that are carried forward with interesting, innovative twists, but are essentially this, the basic outline of the argument for the nature of the soul and why the soul, why one, in the case of Socrates, can be quite confident that the soul will survive the death of the body with which it's joined, and why there's perhaps out of a greater sense of apprehension, why there is hope for Macrina and Gregory to go along with this argument, even while turning it on its head, or as David mentioned in passing before we began our discussion. Well, turning it on its head is the metaphor that he suggested, alluding to Marx and Hegel. And that might be an appropriate metaphor in this sense, that the key issue is that the dualism that Socrates suggests between the soul and the body, and the terms used in Euthyphro are straightforward terms. I assume that I seem to recall, because I wasn't reading the Phaedo, I was reading it in translation, and just as I was reacquainting myself with it, I assume that the term probably is suke, but I know that the term for body that Socrates uses in this dialogue is soma. Much has been made of a slight terminological shift, on the soul and the resurrection in the literature. It's sometimes offered, and I think this is a facile and misleading point. There's an attempt to say that St. Gregory and Macrina are shifting away from this dualism of soul and body, which is going to be used to pivot an argument for the immortality of the soul in Socrates. And there's a shift away from the term soma to the Greek word for flesh, or of the flesh. Sarkinos. I was just looking at a dictionary reference. But Macrina does, I think, also, and again, I was reading On the Soul and the Resurrection in an English translation, but I think she also does use the word soma. Later, as I'll point out, Maximus has no compunction at all about using the term suke and soma in opposition, soul and body in opposition, which is important. So let's just begin. I'm just going to rehearse this and outline. I'm not going to try to go through the steps that Socrates provides. But essentially, Socrates introduces, in a more stark form than Plato later, which is quite interesting, because often we attribute to Plato a kind of untenable dualism between the material and the intelligible world that sunders these apart in a way that most subsequent philosophers have found unsatisfactory because dualisms tend to be unsatisfactory. They're usually corners into which we've been pushed by philosophical difficulties. And it's always as though we're waiting to resolve certain problems that we can eliminate these kinds of distinctions. So Socrates seems to have no compunction at all about describing the material world and the intelligible world. And he uses the language that we've already started to use of the visible, or what Macrina disparages Epicurus for, the kind of visible phenomenal realm, which equates with the material realm, and then the invisible realm. So Socrates' argument is quite straightforward. He applies a kind of nascent version of what I would characterize, jumping forward into the 20th century, as leaning on terms that Brentano and Husserl introduced into our lexicon. Socrates and Macrina, I think even more explicitly, Macrina, St. Gregory, I realized, like Socrates, Macrina didn't put words to paper, and she resembles Socrates in that way. And also Socrates was similarly impoverished and didn't have clothes with which he didn't have sandals, we find in some of the early dialogues. And the intentional argument is where this is the term philosophers use these days, and it simply means that consciousness is always consciousness of something. And this strange phenomenon of consciousness, that the objects of consciousness are not reducible per consciousness to the phenomenal realm, the visible realm, the world that realm that can be characterized by sensory data and the extension of sense data through various mechanisms and the power of mathematics and so on and so forth. And so Socrates has this clean version of the intentional argument that there are things that are invisible, but that we're fully aware of, unmistakably aware of. We're aware of our thoughts, and we wouldn't be made aware of physical things. Now I'm shifting a little bit more to Macrina's argument. If we didn't have this capacity, this intimate acquaintance and grounding in the invisible, and when we think about the soul, we find just from self-reflection, just from looking at the contents of our consciousness, that everything we experience is, in a certain sense, invisible. It's purely in the intelligible, the mental realm. And then Socrates has an early version of the theory of the forms in which he thinks that things like beauty and the good and justice, and one might add, as Plato later does, truth, these things are invariable. They're not subject to, they're not perishable. They're not subject to mutability in the sense that physical things are. And in that sense, they give us a sense of eternity. Insofar as we understand them, we can, of course, quit thinking about them. But insofar as we are thinking about them, we're not thinking about something which is perishable. And this is where the notion, and it's not limited to Plato, it was a notion that was quite familiar going back to Parmenides and earlier and extending right through Greek philosophy, that things that are intelligible or things associated with the logos, the ultimate source of reality, are unchangeable. And Socrates adds to this that they're non-composite. This becomes a familiar distinction in subsequent patristic thought. They're simple, and simple doesn't mean that they are non-complex, but everything within that which is simple is inextricably unified. And so when you're thinking of beauty, you can't reduce beauty to simply different manifestations of beauty. Beauty does manifest itself in particulars, and those particulars are, of course, perishable. A cathedral could burn down, a painting could be destroyed. But there's still a concept of beauty which is itself not subject to this, and goodness is of the same character, and perhaps even more straightforwardly, truth is of this nature. There's a multitude of truths, but the very concept of truth has to be one thing. If it weren't, then we wouldn't be able to apply truth at all. So all of these concepts, they give a sense of that which is invisible and that which is correspondingly incorruptible and unchangeable. And so Socrates uses that basic argument, a kind of intentional argument, to make the point, to put all of his disciples and good friends at ease when they're mourning before him, just before he takes the poison, and afterwards even more intensely at ease, and also to censure them for their grief, because the soul, if it's akin to anything, is akin to that which is these concepts which are impermeable, they're simple, unchanging, and that which is radically distinct from the body. So we have this extraordinary dualism, and to the extent that one goes along with this radical separation of the body and the soul, Socrates makes a fairly compelling point, and it's a haunting point because in different ways, probably we are still haunted by this dualism, and probably every mathematician who has a kind of ontological bent thinks in these terms, thinks of the world of mathematics as a kind of an imperishable, static realm, even though it can be dynamic and vibrant in its relationships, but the entities are unchangeable and eternal. And if the soul is like this, then it, for Socrates, it resembles the divine. And in a striking passage, which I had never really thought about before, but it really is striking because it, like so much of this passage, it anticipates a lot of what Socrates says about that which is changeless and that which is not subject to mutation, and that which is simple in the way that I already suggested. All of that, if it corresponds closely to the nature of the soul as opposed to the body, suggests that all souls are entirely equal, which is an extraordinary thing to say in Socrates' context. And he doesn't flesh this idea out. It's an idea that is just mentioned in passing, but he insists upon it. And it anticipates the moral ontological message of Christianity, which is also obviously grounded in the notion that we're made in the image of God. So it's quite a striking point of anticipation. Socrates, what he does with his radical separation between the body and the soul is suggests a program that would be a useful blueprint for any ascetic who wishes to purge his character of undue association and being glued to use a term Socrates used, to the body. And so there is a kind of excoriating view of that which is associated with the body, which I'll relate to what Anna was saying about grief in just a few moments. And it's quite shocking, actually. Often Christianity, among its some of its critics, including Friedrich Nietzsche, is treated, I think, a little too straightforwardly as a religion that tends to disparage the body. And someone like Nietzsche would have in mind probably some of the desert ascetics living in monasteries who are following certain ascetic practices. And Nietzsche did have this in mind, and he thought it was an unwholesome, it represented an unwholesome disparagement of the passions and the things associated with the body, sexuality, and so on. And Socrates presents as stark an image of this, and I think is more susceptible of this kind of charge than, oddly enough, it's not a charge that Nietzsche in his critique of Socrates raises. It's more Socrates' rationality and his view of Dionysus and Bacchus and what have you, and those elements of Greek philosophy. It's worth recalling, though, and I'll just say this in passing because it's only mentioned in passing in the Phaedo, that Socrates explicitly identifies himself, maybe with a little bit of chutzpah, but as a bacchant and as a proper representation of followers of Dionysus, precisely because he recognizes that the body that we associate with too closely is something that has to be forsaken. We have to willingly embrace, be prepared to embrace death, because with death becomes a form of rebirth. And Socrates, and that isn't entirely fanciful. It seems like a radical revision of Dionysus, but it does suggest that Dionysus brings death and rebirth. So I think Socrates isn't being flippant here. He is And he isn't simply trying to exploit a kind of criticism that might be made against him in relation to the traditional gods. So Socrates seems to be on the path. I could imagine him showing up in a monastery with this kind of shtick and doing quite well and living a highly aesthetic life and talking about the passions in this way and being a rather admirable monk. And I do actually think Socrates comes as close to being a saint, not in some pristine, fastidious sense, but as a whole person, notwithstanding this rather stark dualism that Plato attributes to him in this early mid-dialogue. But at some point, this whole program, which is more or less is taken over holus bolus by Gregory and Macrina, I'll just say by Macrina, is rejected. And where it's rejected is in the notion of the resurrection, which we can't, of course, dissociate from the central, what I take to be the central productive insight, ontological insight of Christianity, namely that the logos, the divine, permeates reality everywhere, permeates nature, and presents a view of nature which is evasive, complex beyond our comprehension, and can't be sequestered into visible phenomena the way Epicurus and some strands of Greek thought would wish to do. And so I think in Christianity, we have the ontological wherewithal to absolutely arrest the untenable dualism, even though it carries us up to a point. And I think this is where I would start to lean on some of the points that the kind of tension that Anna was introducing around the notion of grief. There is a kind of undue attachment to the body that can lead to a kind of blindness. And I don't have to belabor an obvious point. People can become attached to sexual and other desires, avarice, and so on and so forth. This is kind of a familiar point, and one doesn't have to be mired in a kind of hatred of the body to say such a thing. But the body, after all, has been infused with the logos. The logos has become flesh, and I think this is something that every Christian, to the extent that they think of this seriously, ontologically, will not be as hospitable to this dualism of soul and body as some of the critics of Christianity imagine that Christianity is. And so our passions, when they're not extirpated, but when they're transfigured and when they're perhaps arrested, and then through various means, through catharsis, through remedial action, through being drawn by positive thoughts in a way that in time changes the passions and the nature of desire, through, in a word that I think Plato anticipated, the later Socrates anticipated, love, the body becomes not something that is separable from the soul, Suki and Some, as Maximus later deals with. He's still struggling with the legacy of a kind of dualism, but I think when he shifts into a kind of apophatic mode of thought, he brings out what is best on the soul and the resurrection. And he also provides a way of thinking about the resurrection. But the resurrection, just to make a quick point, is radically different from the kind of resurrection that Socrates imagines, because for Socrates, the releasing of oneself from the body means that one is brought into another territory, as it were, metaphysical territory, in which the body doesn't exist, and that's what brings us closer to the gods. And this is, I think, a notion where we're going beyond what we plausibly should be trying to think about. But Christianity offers this hopeful thought, which comes out in the Gospels quite concretely and unmistakably, and it's not through a parable, it's not through mythology, it's through historical testimony, namely that Jesus actually did, when after he was resurrected and spent 3 days in hell, reappear in a different body with different characteristics. He wasn't without a body. He wasn't an incorporeal being, a shade of the sort that Odysseus would have met when he went into Hades and hallucinated after taking certain drugs prescribed to him by Hermes, and hallucinated about these shades. And instead, the historical Jesus actually did appear again with a heavenly body, which we can't begin to think about. We shouldn't try to think too seriously about it. It's beyond empirical inquiry, but it had some of the aspects of a phenomenological account. It was something that could be experienced and was tangible, but it wasn't limited to the categories in which our mutable bodies operate, into which, in the kind of corruption to which they're subject. So there's something that is beyond just, at this point, beyond philosophy and rationality. This is revelation, although it's tantalizingly presented to Christians in historical texts that can't be hermeneutically contained. And I think this is what Maximus is dealing with in a passage which, in a Maximus seminar that all of us and a few other people have been involved with, have looked at occasionally. And it's Maximus, in the striking passage in which he talks, and I'll just quote just one sentence which I quoted recently in a Maximus seminar, that God is, and I'll make some slight changes in the translation to make it closer to the Greek. God is simply and without any limitation or boundaries, indeterminately, in a sense, beyond all of our categories of being. But they point to that he's simply and without boundaries, is that he's beyond but not separable from, because he permeates everything. The point that Maximus makes at the very end of the first volume of the Ambigua. And this, I think, eradicates the dualism that we can't help but to allow to infect our thoughts when we think about our bodies and our souls, but as through a Christian ontology, we can't be mired in this, that we have to keep alive a tension between the body and the soul, but we can't cleanly, absolutely separate them. And Maximus, in the context in which he makes that statement, it's very clear that he's trying to maintain the indissoluble link between the intelligible and the sensory perceptual, and between soma and suke. And that's when he feels compelled to go beyond that and say, but let's not, through our acquaintance with our experience in our bodies and through our minds, try to reduce God to this. It's not that God can't manifest himself through the body and the soul, which is what happens in love, even love construed as agape. But this is where we are moving beyond our concepts. We're not eliminating these concepts because they're helping us to see something that we can get a glimmer of, and that's it. So it's not a kind of negative theology that I'm suggesting. I think Maximus is a little bit more subtle than that. The notion of apophasis is a better word than, or apophatic theology is a better word than negative theology. Maximus is suggesting that we have to think in terms of bodies and souls and the interpenetration of the two when we're talking about a person insofar as they're alive. And then as we think about the person through a resurrection, we're not going to eliminate the body in that concept which none of us can understand. But neither are we going to fixate on the body as we understand it. We're obviously moving beyond that which rationality and rational inquiry, presuppositional inquiry, as well as obviously empirical inquiry leaves us. So I'll end with that apophatic thought and thank David, Andrew, and Anna for grounding thought in more concrete and tangible terms than what I was just doing when because obviously, given the amount of time we have, I'm sort of swimming in a little too close to the theoretical and the abstract. So I'll beg your forgiveness on that count and stop there.
Michael, if I may just push you on a couple of points. That was wonderful, wonderful. Your reference to God is simple and Aristos, you say without boundary. It could also be without horizon, right? Horizon.
That is close to the word that Maximus uses.
And at the beginning, you talked about how our concepts form our boundaries, our horizons, right? We could use that. Horizon is also a familiar word within hermeneutics. If God is simple and without horizon, and our concepts, which are, and you've made this point again and again, I think, well, it's impossible to find meaning in the end without concepts. We need them somehow, but it's our relation to them that is important. So I'm wondering about your understanding of horizon and simplicity and concept within synergy, then, I guess.
I'll try to tread a little carefully here because I have a slightly idiosyncratic thought, and that's when I'm in a kind of philosophical mode, but hopefully I'm thinking of being a philosopher in the sense that Socrates thinks of a philosopher as someone who isn't simply trying to make interesting arguments and points of view. So something which I've really struggled with is the notion when we think about the deity as inadequately, as apophatically as we can, the term simplicity and changelessness is part of the Greek tradition. And I think it's a tradition that we should use carefully. And that's why I think apophatic thought is an apophatic characterization of even these terms that are standardly applied to the divine should make us hesitate and should cause us to be deeply humble. Because there obviously is a sense in which the deity is perfect and therefore unchanging. And this is a familiar argument going back to many Greek philosophers. But God is also this endless, and one could say through his energeia, through his manifestations, a fount of life. And we can't think of the deity in his essence adequately, obviously. But we shouldn't therefore try to characterize his essence, its essence, as either changeable or unchangeable. At times, Maximus, as you well know, will talk about this. He'll say God is neither this or that, mutable or immutable. Even an attempt to characterize God should make us hesitate in this sense, even though we have concepts that go up. So without horizons doesn't mean a kind of emptiness and nothingness, because that is always the atheistic worry that Maximus sometimes raises tantalizingly as a contrast to what he's suggesting. And so we should think of whatever the horizonless is. It's something that's boundless in the sense of fullness, as opposed to just without anything. So it's not nothingness, it's the opposite of nothingness. Because of course, as we know, I mean, coming from a literary philosophical background, that there's a whole school of thought that thinks of indeterminacy of meaning as just dissolving into almost nothing.
And you also said the simple does not forbid the complex, but within, should it be complex, the relations are, I think he says, intrinsic or inescapable, strongly unbreakable anyhow. Does this contrast with an idea of simple as being beyond relation?
That's what Maximus actually says in the passage that I was alluding to, that the divine is beyond all relations. And again, I think at the end of that passage, he actually says, look, those who are moving into a state of being closer to God, they do so in a way beyond our understanding, but in a manner, and I'm going to quote this actually, so I'm not making things up. But those who beyond reason and intellect shall attain the state of divinization, do so in a mode and principle known to God, presumably only known to God. So it's not so God is beyond all relations that we could configure and analyze and try to contain and comfortably create an ontology on the basis of. But God is, I should just stop talking here, because we shouldn't, in saying that God is beyond all relations, we don't know what the contrast is, because the contrast is beyond us. But we shouldn't think of it as something that is that we're slyly trying to think our way into.
Michael, I had a quote for you, because when you were talking, I really liked this idea of the anti-dualism, Macrina, and I'll just share, because I was so struck by this when I was reading it, sort of illustrating your point, how she goes beyond dualism. And so she says, so Gregory asks, how do body and soul stay together when, for example, if a body decomposes or is burned or is, its elements are scattered everywhere, how then can we reconstitute or reunite the body with the soul? And here's what she says. Therefore, nothing hinders the soul from being present to the elements of the body, both when they are mixed together by their combination and when they are dissolved by their separation. When gold and silver are welded together, a certain artistic power is envisioned, which fuses the materials together. And if again, the one is melted away from the other, nonetheless, the principle of the art remains in each. The material is separated into parts, but the art is not split along with the material. For how could the indivisible be divided? According to the same reasoning, the intellectual nature of the soul appears in the combination of the elements and does not disappear when they are dissolved, but remains in them. Although it is stretched out with their separation, it is not cut apart, nor is it chopped into parts and pieces according to the number of the elements. Therefore, the soul is in those elements, which has once entered, and no necessity breaks it off from its union with them. Which is just amazing.
Yeah. No.
That
Yeah.
it's almost as if the soul loves every little atom or infuses every little atom of our bodies, which is so different from, it's not a vessel or and it remembers every little atom, even when separated. So anyway, I thought of that when you were speaking.
I remember reading that. What page was that on? Just sort of
48.
Oh, okay, I was looking much later when she has this wonderful Heraclitean image of a fire on a wick. But I won't try to quote it because I can't remember the end to which what purpose she was using that image for. It just struck me at the time.
So I really love it.
I just wanted to ring the changes a little bit on a couple of things that Anna said. One is when you talked about Macrina not leaving anything tangible. That little line in the Maximus that I read about the saint without their souls leaving so much as a footprint in any of its pleasures, in any of its mutabilities, I guess. I also, I was wondering what you were going to do with how the book didn't end where you thought it should end. And then that addition of the story, and it was lovely that you pulled it forward that way. It really is, in a sense, it's almost a kind of coda on the whole thing. And grief. In the throes of grief, we think we're blind because it possesses us so thoroughly. And that's a good thing, it seems to me. I mean, it speaks of the depth of the love, the depth of our caring, the depth of how we see that relationship. And also living through it, not stepping aside of it, living through it. You said that becomes a kind of cure for the blindness. That is, living through it, one begins to see the world larger. And in the Christian East, and of course in the Latin Church as well, you have that lovely sense of the great cloud of witnesses, that nothing passes away. It's only a question whether our relationship to it is one in which we are haunted or in which we are blessed. So this is a bit aside to it, but as you were speaking about that, I was also remembering how struck I was when I first began to learn a bit about the liturgical life of the Christian East. This was shortly after my father had died. So that certainly was a living presence for me. And I remember after attending to the cycles of services in Holy Week, and then of a man who died during Holy Week, who was then buried at the beginning of Bright Week, and realizing that the services of Holy Week are it's the icon of what we do with everyone who we know and love, or maybe even don't even love, who is in a struggle at the end of their life and who comes to depart this world. And everybody gets nailed down, as the Russians say. Every life ends in a crucifixion. And I was thinking about how the tradition has given us this cycle of services, both around dying. Not many people are availed of them, I don't think. But then around death and vigil and burial, and then around memory. And I recall when I first witnessed this in a little rural Romanian parish, where there was still a few, several women in that rural community who were, you probably know the word for this, but they were kind of the, they were the chorus for the mourning. They wailed at the grave. So they are the equivalent of, of what Andrew's friend Peter is in the liturgy. They're bringing people in to the expressions of grief. It's extraordinary how it played out. And then a few days later, another gathering to remember this person. And then 30 days later, but a whole set of them in a thoroughgoing liturgical life, a whole set of them in which the grief is held, it's tenderly held, and it is placed, it's drawn very near to the passion and death of Jesus Christ. In a sense, they're sung together. And then after, I can't even remember how many days it is, maybe you do, 50 days or something like that, the community gathers for ostensibly reading the person, this particular person, into the great cloud of witnesses. And they have a feast. And only then, at least in my experience, my little experience of this, does the grief begin to move into joyous remembrance. So that kind of cycle of liturgical services isn't peculiar to Christianity. Orthodoxy has a full-blown form of it. You find it in other religious traditions as well, because the grief is seen as normal, necessary, real. And in some cases, as you spoke about it so lovely, it becomes itself a cure for blindness, for seeing the world larger, no longer seeing the world through the prism of death. And I would sure like to know, though, Michael, about this heavenly body that we acquire. It remains so beyond me. So beyond me. I can certainly think of it as the body of Christ. Yeah, it's a mystery to me.
Some of the sources I read talk about it as garments of light, which I find, I don't know, for me, people are more familiar with some of the traditions than I am, so, but I was reading into it, and, that originally Adam was clothed in glory, right? Clothed. He did not need the sun because he had the sun within him, right? This idea of luminous beings. And how we then receive our garments of skin, right? Our earthly bodies. And I think this is in Macrina as well. But obviously it's totally incomprehensible, but I just, for some reason, though incomprehensible, I adore it. I have no idea what it means, but I just love it. So I just really moved by that. But I wanted to, David, I'm curious what you think about this, because you've actually really moved me to rethink some of the stuff about grief. We talked a little bit about Protestantism beforehand, and we shouldn't really. But I think one of the reasons why I couldn't ever become a Protestant is because, for me, my very limited experience, death can also bring renewed presence or different presence with the departed, even in absence. I don't know, maybe I'm speaking too far out of turn, but the cloud of witnesses, I think, in our tradition is so much more palpable, so much more real, so much there. They are alive still. And I could never give up the saints and the cloud of witnesses and those who are, in the Russian tradition, they say at the grave, after the funeral is over, they say, Christ is risen. And I think the idea being that this person is sort of an imitation of, why seek ye the living among the dead, right? Which has come to me a couple of times when someone has died. Why seek ye the living among the dead?
Yeah, and we say memory eternal. May we remember you in the eternal. May we remember you in the heart of God. May you become part again of the body of Christ, which we became dull at seeing as you were dying. We thought you were only dying.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
I mentioned my father having died just before, or shortly thereafter, a year or two thereafter, I began to look at Orthodox liturgical life. And I remember both my parents were Lutheran, and they had Catholic friends, but of course we also have the Book of Concord in the house, which is one of the great books of Reformation hate literature. And if we had, if my parents had some Catholics come over, I would, as a little boy, reach over for the Book of Concord and see if I could read a passage out loud about the ruler of Babylon. So it was my sportiveness in that context. But in the face of it, it was so vivid to me how there was no language. There was no language for my father's having departed this world. And so I had, within a year, less than a year of his entering the eternal, I had discovered the prayers for the dead in the Roman Catholic tradition, in the office of the church, and they're remarkable. So I remember saying to my mother, next Sunday it'll be the anniversary of my father's, your husband's, departure of this world. Let's have dinner together, which we did. And then after dinner, I said, do you mind if I pray something? She said, well, of course you can pray something. I said, well, it's something that Martin Luther would have known. Martin Luther would have prayed this. It's a prayer which remembers my father. She said, okay, sure. So I prayed this. I did not invoke the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos. That would have been a bridge too far for her. But of course, you mentioned the name of the departed. And my mother wept. We both wept. We all wept. She was so grateful, so grateful. So I began to think about it. What's happened here? Well, Luther, if there's Luther, I love Luther. Because of the decadence in the Catholic Church, and because of people like Johannes Tetzel, and the way in which indulgences were used to build St. Peter's, and the way in which he exercised a whole kind of spiritual terrorism on people. You need to donate, and then we will pray the soul of your beloved child out of purgatory. I mean, that has got to be one of the most awful things that human beings have ever done. I mean, if the hell exists that I don't believe in, Tetzel will be there. I mean, this is just unbelievable to do that. But Luther, because it was so deeply problematic, Luther decided that the cult of the saints has to be removed from the prayer of the church. And that meant the prayers of the dead. So if there's one thing I could have changed about the Reformation, it would have been that. I don't know how you could, because I understand why he did it. But when we think of the effect of that, it really meant the loss of any language within our Protestant culture for holding the eternal and the mortal together. No language for our sorrow and our grief, and for the opening that you spoke of that it gives. That's not to say that still doesn't occur, it obviously does, but there's no real language for it within Protestantism. I think it is to my mind one of the most profound shifts in human culture that I know of. That shift that occurred there. And of course, it's given us now a therapeutic culture, because people don't have that in any way, but every single counselor, every single spiritual director, call them what you will, they spend all their time talking with people about those people who are dead. I mean, whether they're spiritually dead or physically dead doesn't make much difference, but they're dead nevertheless. And the culture assumes they disappeared, but they didn't. They're always hanging around in our minds and our hearts. So the way in which this text, and I don't know when this cycle of services developed within the Christian East, but it'd be very interesting to know how that took hold. And of course, this particular text, I mean, the Life of Macrina, I know that there's a portion of that finds its way into the monastic office of the Roman Catholic Church associated with this. In any case, it is having a language for this. I would have entered the Orthodox Church simply for that. That'd be enough for me.
That the language was there for Macrina, that this rhythm was there in the tradition for Macrina, is what makes it not extraordinary. Yeah, it's drawn forth. Right. I like that, David. I like that. And if you think then, if the shift from a language of grief and loss and memory to a series of concepts one applies to case studies, that's the process of abstraction, which Anna, you beautifully indicated the complete opposite in the text of how idea and person are not separable, how it's integral. And then so the idea of integral, and then Michael, you drew in simplicity. That's beautiful.
And of course, your idea of dialogue, Andrew, right? The dialogue, that the drawing near through grief, then the dialogue of grief, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's there as well.
And you began, Michael, by suggesting you didn't really talk about it at all, but I would love to hear you say more about it. Just those two words and how they dialogue and dialectic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd never really quite thought about them together before, but the one has the logos in it, and the other one has, what does it have? Lectic. Is it lex? Is it?
I don't know. I'm in
like lectionary.
Andrew, you're good at unpacking etymology. Why don't you have a go?
Like lectionary. It's the abstract word. In my way of framing that. Dialogos. Bakhtin, who is in our tradition as well, says that dialectic is kind of term against term, and logos is living voice in presence, encounter with living voice. So he says, strip everything personal and human and warm and continuous and so on out of dialogue, and you get dialectic. And that's what's so beautiful about what Anna did. She shows that this is not in a dialectic form, idea against idea. It's person and person, right? And then Michael, you showed how we don't have to think about the person or the idea. No, it's even, Socrates was already trying to do this, but we see it come to, I think you said come to a fullness or something like that, or fully expressed in something, the tradition in which, out of which Gregory and Macrina speak.
It would be lovely as well to have someone read the Life of Macrina and the death of Socrates together, to have them sing together in a bit of it would be, that was so interesting to me to realize. Of course, neither of them wrote. Friends were around. The grief element that was there, the way in which they both spoke, endeavored to speak a luminous word to those that had gathered and who cared. And when they died, that did not lessen the grief. The grief became more, at least for a time. But yeah, that's how. George Steiner did his lovely little treatment of two dinners, on Christ and Socrates, as well as speaking about their deaths. But that, yeah, I'm going to think more about that. With that Socrates text and the Macrina text. So thank you for that. That was great. One thing, Andrew, you spoke and you read a little piece about God drawing his own to himself. So one can't help but hear the words at the center of the liturgy in that. Thine own of thine own we offer to thee. Thine own of thine own, and we are it.
Unto thee and on behalf of thee. That's apophatic movement right there. That's the most profoundly beautiful thing possible.
Right there at that's the crescendo of the liturgical prayer. And it's all about bread and wine. So I have some wine. Do you want to come over?